welcome to Edison Open House Global Healthcare 2021. In this session today, we're going to showcase the work of Telix. It's an Australian company and it works in an area which, in my view, doesn't receive the accolades that it ought to do. It is nuclear medicine, the use of radiopharmaceuticals to both diagnose and treat cancer and other conditions. I'm delighted to welcome their Chief Business Officer, David Cade. David, tell me a bit more about Telix.
Well, thank you, Vivienne. As you introduced, Telix is a radiopharmaceutical company. It's listed locally here in Sydney on the Australian Securities Exchange. And what the company has is a very comprehensive late-stage portfolio of what we term molecularly targeted radiation products. And these span a series of cancers, specifically prostate, renal and glioblastoma cancers, as well as a series of rare diseases, including multiple myeloma and amyloidosis. These are very significant total addressable markets. If we look at them by value and consider prostate cancer as an example, for the imaging and therapy of prostate cancer, these are $850 million and $4 billion markets in US dollar terms, respectively. The company has its first product, which is known as Telix 591 CDX. This is a kit for the preparation of gallium-68 labelled PSMA-11, which is for the prostate cancer PET imaging. This has really emerged only in the last year as the new standard of care for advanced prostate cancer imaging. 2020 was a very substantial year. We've obviously just closed that out. During the year, the company achieved some very significant commercial milestones on the way to launching that first product, Telix 591 CDX, for prostate cancer imaging. Specifically, the company filed its first marketing authorization application with the European authorities back in April of last year. We followed that up with a new drug application to the US FDA in September of 2020. And we have a very clear commercial launch plan for the United States with commercial distribution agreements with Cardinal Health and PharmaLogic for commercial launch in the United States. Europe is slightly different. The company acquired a very substantial radiopharmaceutical production facility in Belgium for the manufacturing of these radiopharmaceutical imaging and therapeutic products. So it's more an approach of vertical integration. But that's 2020. What we are, I think, more interested in is what lies ahead in 2021. And so during the next 12 months, the company will transition to commercialization as a phase 3 therapeutics company with a very clear growth strategy. What I mean by that is that just in November of last year, Telix completed a very substantial transaction with a Chinese pharmaceutical company known as China Grand Pharma. What that delivered was a $100 million Australian dollar balance sheet to Telix. So very substantial financial capacity for 2021 and 2022. And what that enables the company to do is to achieve several very important milestones during the next year. They include completion of the company's phase 3 Zircon trial, which is examining the company's second product for kidney cancer imaging. We believe that study will complete recruitment in the second quarter and will submit to the regulatory authorities in the second half of 2021. That product was granted breakthrough drug designation for kidney cancer imaging by the US FDA late last year. The second major milestone is launching the ProstACT phase 3 randomized controlled trial for prostate therapy, and that will be launched in the first half of 2021. Thirdly, the company expects to transition to revenue generation in the second half of 2021. And of course, we plan to extend our reach into Asia with a very clear Asian expansion plan for Japan, China, and South Korea. I'll just move on to a description of how these molecularly targeted radiation drugs work. I've got some, I think it's always nice to use pictures. Essentially, the drugs target a unique cancer target, typically expressed on the cell membrane of a cancer cell. And then the drugs really can be considered as consisting of three components. The first component is a targeting agent, which can either be a small molecule or a large molecule, like a monoclonal antibody, which targets a specific cancer cell target, usually expressed on the cell membrane of that cancer cell. There's the second part of the drug is some unique linker chemistry that links the radioactive payload to the targeting moiety. Then, of course, the third component is the radioactive payload itself. And that payload can be one of two types of radiation, really putting it really basically. The first type is a type of radiation that can be imaged or registered in a PET scanner for the imaging of these cancers, or the radiation can be switched out for a therapeutic isotope that delivers a lethal dose of radiation to the target cancer cell. Typically, the drugs are injected or administered systemically, like conventional chemotherapy or immunotherapy drugs that we use for cancers. They circulate around the body and bind very rapidly to the cancer target. And what they furnish the clinician with is really the ability to do two things. First of all, to see the cancer, and then secondly, to treat the cancer, should that be the desire, based on what type of burden the patient has. The isotopes we use for imaging are typically isotopes like gallium-68 or zirconium-89. These drugs are injected into the patient, and then 20 or 30 minutes later, the patient is placed in the PET scanner, and very exquisite images are generated that really light up, or they give up the position of the cancer in the body, so that it can't be sequestered anymore. It's actually seen where it is, and I've got some examples there of a patient with prostate cancer demonstrating metastases in that patient's mid-thoracic and upper thoracic spine, and some lesions in the front of the chest in the sternum. So it gives up the position of the cancer. And then really, if we decide that we want to treat those cancers, typically they're advanced stage 4 cancers that we are using these drugs on, we will use a therapeutic isotope that will then deliver a radiation dose to that target cancer. Vivienne, I might pause there and see if you have any questions about that approach.
And presumably with this approach, only the cancer cells are receiving a radiation dose and not any healthy tissue.
Well, that's an excellent question. So I'll answer it by way of example. So if we look at prostate cancer, for example, it's the most commonly diagnosed cancer in men. In the United States, to give you some numbers, there's about 200,000 patients diagnosed with prostate cancer a year. Thankfully, by virtue of screening, most men are diagnosed at an early stage of their disease, and they can be offered treatment with the intent to cure them. So we offer them either a prostatectomy, or we treat them with radiation therapy, and each of those options is considered curative. But unfortunately, once that patient has been cured, in the ensuing months or years, there can be recurrence, which is first manifest by a rising simple blood test known as the PSA test, which can be done by the family doctor or by the patient's specialist. And unfortunately, when there's on the blood test a suggestion of recurrence of their prostate cancer, we don't have imaging today, using a CT scan or an MRI scan that is of sufficient resolution to be able to identify that very early recurrence of the disease. And what we have to do is we actually have to wait, sitting around on our hands, as a clinician with our patient, waiting for the disease to get big enough to be able to get seen by a CT scanner. What this type of imaging does is it can image that very early recurrence at when it's microscopic still, when it's very small. And by imaging it earlier, we can take interventions that re-establish the intent to cure that patient. So the imaging is very important. And then secondly, if we look at therapy, again, using prostate cancer as, I think, the example, as I said, most patients are diagnosed early and can be cured. But of that 200,000 patients a year in the United States that are diagnosed with prostate cancer. There's about 30,000 of them that end up, unfortunately, with metastatic, in other words, stage 4 or advanced prostate cancer that is what we call castrate resistant. In other words, it's not responding to our efforts to block testosterone, which drives the prostate cancer. And those patients, when they get to that point, really have sort of 18 to 24 months of survival left. So there's a clear need for additional treatments in those later, more advanced stages of disease. And that's where these drugs come in to actually treat those stages of disease as well.
And presumably you've got that precision payload with radiopharmaceuticals, so you're not bombarding healthy tissue with radiation. You're only bombarding exactly the bits that need to be bombarded.
Yes, the target is uniquely expressed on the cancer. So whether it's a prostate cancer expressing prostate-specific membrane antigen or PSMA, or whether it's a kidney cancer expressing the target carbonic anhydrase 9, these targets are expressed uniquely on the cancer cell and not on normal tissue. So it enables us to deliver radiation therapy not as a beam, sent into the body from a large piece of capital equipment in the hospital, but as radiation therapy really from the inside out rather than the outside in. And it enables us to spare the adjacent normal healthy tissue very exquisitely.
Let me ask you some more questions about your China Grand Pharma deal. Now, there's been a very considerable deterioration in relationship between China and Australia recently. Do you see that political situation affecting your relationships in China?
Look, there certainly has been a degradation in the relationship between the political parties of Australia and China, and there's been some very significant efforts taken to stymie the trade between the two countries. Thankfully, I think when it comes down to people in business and people in medicine and people operating in the science domains, we recognise that if we have effective new medical developments, both in the diagnostic and therapeutic arena for cancer patients, thankfully, the answer is that it has not at all affected our ability to do business with some very collaborative Chinese partners. And I think it's important to say that if one is in a healthcare company, a life sciences company, and one wants to establish global market leadership in a certain area, it is not really possible without a very clear plan for China. 20 years ago, China was not a substantial market. In 20 years' time, China will clearly be the world's most important market, and it's clear to have a plan for China. So we're very thankful that we have been able to identify a very strong partner in China Grand Pharma. They're extraordinarily professional to deal with, and the transaction was successfully completed late last year. What it does is it gives us not just a strong balance sheet, but a clear and proven partner to access the China market and bring these life-saving therapies to Chinese patients in need.
Now, you've made a recent acquisition, TheraPharm. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yes, TheraPharm is at the other end of the scale in terms of size. It was about a 10 million euro transaction, so a relatively small one. TheraPharm is a Swiss-German biotech company based in Bern in Switzerland. The purpose of that acquisition was to acquire an asset known as bezolizumab, which is a monoclonal antibody that targets a cancer target known as CP66, which is expressed on white blood cells, or specifically neutrophils. The purpose of that asset is that there's a whole series of both oncologic, in other words, cancer, and non-cancer diseases that we treat by doing a stem cell transplant. And to do that, we have to essentially ablate or wipe out the bone marrow before we do that. Traditionally, the way we wipe out a patient's bone marrow, in other words, to reset the immune system so that we can do a stem cell transplant, involves obscenely toxic chemotherapy drugs, including drugs like melphalan, that have a huge impost on the quality of life of the patient. In fact, there's quite a significant treatment-related mortality with the drugs we use to ablate a patient's bone marrow before we do a stem cell transplant. So molecularly targeted radiation targeted at the bone marrow appears to be, from the existing data, a much more tolerable way to reset the patient's immune system, to wipe out the bone marrow before doing a stem cell transplant, to give the patient essentially a new immune system and a new bone marrow.
Can you tell me a bit more about your manufacturing and your commercialization strategy?
Yes, certainly, Vivienne. So what we've aimed to do is to generate a kit form for these radiopharmaceuticals, primarily for the diagnostic agents, but it also applies to some of the therapeutic agents. So in the United States, when we launch our first product, we will essentially be using a kit that will be placed into a Cardinal Health or a pharmacological nuclear pharmacy, and those kits will be in inventory. And when the drug is required for a prostate cancer PET imaging scan to be performed on a patient, the kit will be taken, essentially from the cupboard, from inventory, in a 5-minute benchtop process. The radioactive isotope known as gallium-68 is placed onto the drug, and the final drug product, which is the radio-labeled drug product, is made within 5 minutes. It's then shipped out to the hospital or the imaging centre and delivered within the next 90 minutes to the site where the imaging is done. Europe is a little bit different.
And that's an advance, isn't it, on where you are previously, because the handling of radionuclides in the past has been very involved. Naturally, there are a lot of safety considerations, and maybe that's been a reason why it hasn't been taken up with as much enthusiasm as perhaps it should have done.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So rather than each individual hospital having to have its own in-house nuclear pharmacy prepare the drug, which is laborious and it requires, discrete quality control measures before release. Every hospital, including smaller regional and rural hospitals, and also standalone radiology imaging centres, can simply have a local nuclear pharmacy prepare the imaging agent for delivery. They don't have to do anything. They place an order with Cardinal Health, they receive the imaging agent, and they can perform the prostate cancer PET scan. So it really facilitates the broad-scale dissemination of this standard of care imaging to essentially 95% of the US population that needs access to this state-of-the-art imaging. Previously, it wasn't able to be done that way. Europe's a little bit different. Telix has now acquired its own manufacturing facility in Belgium, as I talked about. That's more about vertical integration. So Telix will manufacture a lot of its drugs, both diagnostic and therapeutic, in Belgium and ship them around Western Europe from there.
Finally, a question about your long-term funding. What's your plan there?
We have at the start of 2021, in Australian dollar terms, a $100 million balance sheet, which I've mentioned will fund the company for all of this year and will enable us to complete our key phase 3 trials. We do expect to raise further capital. It'll probably be our last capital raise, probably towards the end of 2021, say Q4 of 2021. And that's likely to be a substantial capital raise, probably of the order of $100 million. And then following that revenue and positive cash flow, we expect to be sufficient to fund the business. So it's likely that that'll be the last of 4 capital raises, 3 to date and one fourth one, if we don't include the capital injection from China Grand Pharma late last year.
2020 has been a very difficult year for everyone. How are you feeling about 2021?
Vivienne, look, certainly COVID was a very significant factor in 2020. It remains so. The primary impact that it had on our Telix business was the ability to recruit patients into clinical trials. So there's no doubt been at least a 6-month impact on the recruitment of our key Zircon trial. That is now recruiting again at a very, very reasonable rate, and we expect to complete recruitment of that in Q2 of 2021. But really, I think we've managed to operate otherwise very seamlessly, other than the impact on trial recruitment, because obviously acute hospital resources are focused on the management of COVID. I really do hope that in the United States and Europe that COVID is able to be brought under control via public health measures and vaccines. But we believe that 2021 will be a very positive year. We'll be able to complete our trials and we'll be able to move into commercialisation with the first product getting to market and generating positive revenue. So we don't see any major ongoing impacts to our business, fortunately.
David, thank you so much. And radiopharmaceuticals, remember them, very, very important in the treatment of cancer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vivienne, and thank you everyone for listening to today's presentation. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.